Dearest listeners, before we embark upon a tale of love born not in ballrooms but in ledger books, this author must beg your small indulgence. If these chronicles bring you joy, do grace this humble storyteller with your likes. Subscribe so that future tales may always find you, and leave your thoughts below. This author is most curious to learn from which corner of our vast world you listen. Now then, with such pleasantries attended to, let us begin. Our story commences, as all the most unexpected romances do, not with beauty meeting beauty, but with prejudice meeting its match. Society, that great arbiter of worth, had long ago decided that Miss Margaret Hartley, Meg to those brave enough to claim friendship, was precisely what a young lady ought not to be. But worry not, gentle listeners, for this author has witnessed enough seasons to know that society's judgments are often as substantial as morning mist. Miss Margaret Hartley, dearest listeners, was what the Ton delicately termed substantial. At 24, she had endured 3 London seasons, each more humiliating than the last. This author recalls with perfect clarity the Pembridge Ball of 1809, where young Lord Pembridge actually laughed, when his mother suggested he dance with her. The sound echoed across the ballroom like a death knell for poor Meg's social prospects. Her father, Mr. Josiah Hartley, was that peculiar breed of man, a merchant so successful that society could not entirely ignore him, yet not quite successful enough to make them forget his trade connections. He dealt in fabrics, the finest silks from China, muslins from India, wools from Scotland. Half the Ton wore his imports while pretending not to know his name. Such delicious hypocrisy, gentle listeners. This author observed Meg often during those painful seasons. She possessed the most unfortunate combination of attributes for a young lady of her time: a sharp mind, a fuller figure, and a fortune just large enough to attract fortune hunters, but not large enough to overcome prejudice. Her face, and one must be honest here, was rather lovely. Clear gray eyes that sparkled with intelligence, skin like Devon cream, and a smile that, when genuine, could light up even the dreariest assembly room. But society, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that such features were wasted on her figure. The cruelty, dearest listeners, was casual and constant. This author once overheard the venomous Lady Worthington declare that it was such a pity, such a pretty face on such an unfortunate form, if only the girl would show some restraint at the dinner table. Meg had developed a way of moving through ballrooms that this author can only describe as apologetic, as if she were perpetually begging pardon for the space she occupied. She dressed in dark colors on her mother's insistence, those shades deemed slimming, and spent most balls seated with the wallflowers and widows, pretending to enjoy watching others dance. But here is what society failed to notice, what this author discovered through careful observation. Miss Hartley possessed a mind for numbers that would humble a Cambridge mathematician. While other young ladies practiced their pianoforte, Meg balanced her father's ledgers. While they painted watercolors, she calculated import duties and profit margins. She could determine the value of a shipment faster than an experienced clerk, and had once caught an embezzlement scheme that saved her father thousands of pounds. Enter our hero, though one uses that term advisedly, for Mr. Thomas Wentworth was nobody's idea of a romantic champion. At 29, he was the eldest son of Sir Edmund Wentworth, a baronet whose title was perhaps the only thing about him that remained impressive. The Wentworth lands, once prosperous, had been decimated by Sir Edmund's combination of gambling, poor judgment, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge that times had changed. Thomas, never Tom, he insisted on Thomas, had returned from university to find his inheritance in ruins. Rather than flee to London to seek a wealthy bride like his younger brother, he had rolled up his sleeves and set to work. This author has it on excellent authority that he rose before dawn each day, walked his fields, knew every tenant by name, and was not above putting his own back into harvest work when needed. Society found him puzzling. He attended the minimum social functions required by his status, but one could often detect the faint scent of hay about his person, and his hands, despite good breeding, bore the calluses of actual work. Mothers with marriageable daughters were conflicted. He would inherit a title, yes, But what good was a baronet who smelled of the stables? The Thursday evening that would change everything was hosted by Mrs. Pemberton, whose gatherings were known for three things: excellent wine, mediocre music, and the kind of social climbing that required ropes and pulleys. The autumn of 1812 had been particularly wet, and this author recalls the mud that clung to everyone's hems, despite the best efforts of numerous footmen. It was at this gathering, gentle listeners, that fate decided to intervene with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge. Meg had stationed herself in her usual spot, a chair partially hidden by an enormous arrangement of hothouse flowers, close enough to the refreshment table that she need not walk far, but distant enough from the dancing that no gentleman would feel obligated to ask her to stand up. She had brought a small notebook, disguised as a prayer book, in which she was calculating the probable profit margins of her father's latest venture into Bengal cotton. Thomas Wentworth, meanwhile, had been cornered by Mrs. Dalrymple, whose daughter Cecilia was, in her mother's words, accomplished in all the feminine arts. This author witnessed the poor man's eyes glaze over as Cecilia demonstrated her accomplishments by reciting, at length, a poem about daffodils that she had clearly memorized without understanding a word. In his desperate escape from this floral recitation, Thomas backed directly into the flower arrangement that sheltered our Meg. The collision was spectacular. Water from the vases soaked his evening coat. Lilies attached themselves to his hair, and Meg's notebook, with all its damning calculations, flew from her hands and landed, pages spread, at the feet of the astounded Mrs. Dalrymple. The lady's exclamation of horror upon discovering the notebook contained mathematical sums rather than poetry drew the attention of the entire room. This author must confess to holding her breath as Meg's face turned the precise shade of the peonies now decorating Mr. Wentworth's shoulders. Here was social death, laid out in neat columns of figures. But then, oh dearest listeners, then something extraordinary occurred. Thomas Wentworth bent down, retrieved the notebook, and studied it with an intensity that transformed his pleasant but unremarkable features into something altogether different. His eyes, brown and previously noted only for their tendency to look longingly toward exits, lit up with genuine interest. He recognized the calculations as import duties on Bengal cotton, noting with surprise that she had already factored in the new tariffs announced only the week prior. When he inquired how she could possibly know of such recent developments, Meg managed to stammer that she had her sources through her father's business. The revelation that her father owned Hartley Textiles brought recognition to Thomas's face, and his next observation that surely her father employed clerks for such work drew from Meg the admission that clerks made mistakes. She had, just last month, caught an error that would have cost them £300. The awe in Thomas's voice when he repeated the sum was unmistakable, and thus began a most unusual conversation. Standing amidst lily petals and scandal, surrounded by horrified matrons and tittering debutantes, Mr. Thomas Wentworth and Miss Margaret Hartley discussed import duties, profit margins, and the effect of weather on wool prices. This author must report that Mrs. Dalrymple looked positively apoplectic. Cecilia had been forgotten entirely, left holding her daffodil poem like a shield against the horror of watching her intended quarry become fascinated by the merchant's fat daughter. The conversation revealed that both had noticed the peculiar fact that Scottish wool commanded a 15% premium over Irish, despite negligible quality difference. Thomas confessed his frustration that his estates produced excellent wool, but buyers insisted on Scottish provenance. He had been contemplating whether it might be worth shipping fleeces to Scotland simply to ship them back with Scottish papers, a practice Meg immediately identified as fraud, then blushed at her boldness. Thomas's grim response that the difference between fraud and business these days seemed mainly a matter of who was defining the terms drew from Meg a look of understanding that this author found most telling. What escaped the rest of the assembled company, but not this author's keen eye, was the way Mr. Wentworth looked at Miss Hartley. It was not the polite, unfocused gaze of social interaction, nor the calculating assessment of a fortune hunter. It was the look of a man who had been searching for something without knowing what it was, only to suddenly find it in the most unexpected place. Over the following weeks, dearest listeners, this author observed a most peculiar courtship. though neither party would have called it such. Mr. Wentworth began appearing at Hartley Textiles with remarkable frequency, always claiming business with Mr. Hartley. That gentleman, shrewd enough to recognize opportunity when it knocked, would conveniently be called away on urgent matters, leaving his daughter to assist Mr. Wentworth with his inquiries. Their consultations, this author learned from a well-placed parlor-maid, were unlike any courtship the girl had ever witnessed. Instead of pretty compliments and poetry, there were discussions of crop rotation and compound interest. Instead of flowers, Thomas brought farming almanacs. Instead of sheet music, Meg presented carefully drafted financial projections for estate improvements. Society, naturally, was baffled and appalled in equal measure. Lady Pemberton whispered at her next gathering about the Wentworth heir visiting the merchant's house in broad daylight repeatedly. Mrs. Worthington replied with that particularly vicious sympathy that was her specialty, suggesting the poor man must be desperate, that the estates must be in worse condition than thought if he was reduced to begging loans from trade. But this author knew better. This author had seen Thomas's face when Meg explained a particularly clever accounting method that would save his estate £50 per annum. It was the face of a man not begging, but discovering treasure. The first real test came at the Michaelmas Fair. Thomas had a booth selling wool from his estates, and Meg, there with her father to assess potential suppliers, stopped to examine his samples. This author positioned herself strategically behind a display of preserves to observe. Meg informed him without preamble that his wool was underpriced. When Thomas explained his need for quick sales to support the estates, she countered that he needed sustainable income, not quick sales. Her suggestion to price it 15% higher and market it as heritage wool from ancient pastures to London merchants who supplied the nobility, they would pay for the story as much as the wool, drew from Thomas an exclamation of admiration for her brilliance. Their meetings continued, but always under the guise of business. When they encountered each other at social gatherings, they would speak of practical matters while the ton watched in horrified fascination. This author once witnessed them spend an entire waltz interval. He didn't ask her to dance, of course, that would have been too much, discussing the relative merits of different fertilizers. Lady Dalrymple proclaimed it unnatural for a young man and woman to discuss manure. But here's what the gossips missed, what this author's keen eye detected: the way Thomas's hand would hover near Meg's when they both reached for the same ledger. The way Meg's face would light up when she saw him enter a room, then quickly dim as she remembered her place. The way Thomas would unconsciously lean toward her when she spoke, as if drawn by magnetism. The moment of truth, gentle listeners, came in November, during an unseasonably cold snap that had everyone worried about their winter stores. Thomas had been struggling with a crucial decision about his estates, whether to sell a parcel of land to cover immediate debts or attempt to hold out for a better harvest next year. He appeared at Hartley Textiles on a Thursday afternoon, looking haggard. This author's sources report that Mr. Hartley, with unusual perception, took one look at the young man and declared he had urgent business at his club. Meg and Thomas were left alone in the office, with only a deaf elderly clerk in the outer room for propriety. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes and the worry lines around Thomas's eyes. For 3 hours, they worked side by side. Meg's quick mind dove through his accounts like a seal through water, finding patterns and possibilities Thomas had missed. She discovered an old lease that could be renegotiated, identified unnecessary expenses that could be cut, and created a financial plan that would save the estates without selling land. When Thomas expressed his wonderment that her plan could actually work, he used her Christian name for the first time, Meg. This author has it on good authority that her hands trembled as she set down her pen. She tried for brightness in her response about mathematics never lying, but achieved something closer to breathlessness. Thomas's soft agreement carried weight beyond the words, for he was no longer looking at the papers but at her. The moment stretched between them, taut as a violin string. This author learned from the parlor maid, who had it from the clerk's assistant, who happened to be passing by the window, that Thomas actually reached for Meg's hand. Their fingers were perhaps an inch apart when the door burst open. Mrs. Hartley entered in a whirlwind of silk and social ambition, followed by, heaven preserve us, Mrs. Dalrymple and Cecilia. The announcement of their arrival for tea carried the kind of desperate cheer that suggested this was not Mrs. Hartley's idea. The spell was broken. Thomas withdrew his hand, Meg busied herself with papers, and tea was served with a side of excruciating awkwardness. Mrs. Dalrymple spent the entire visit making pointed comments about the unsuitability of young ladies involving themselves in masculine pursuits while shooting venomous looks at Meg. This author noticed something Mrs. Dalrymple did not: the way Thomas's jaw tightened with each insult, the way his hands clenched when Mrs. Dalrymple suggested that some people should know their place. A storm was building behind those brown eyes, though it would not break for some weeks yet. The catastrophe, when it came, was both public and devastating. This author was present at the Pemberton Christmas ball and can report every excruciating detail. The evening had begun promisingly enough. Thomas had actually asked Meg to dance, a country dance where her size was less noticeable among the moving figures. This author observed that they moved together with surprising grace, she light on her feet despite society's assumptions, he steadier than usual, as if her presence grounded him. They had completed their set and were walking toward the refreshment table when disaster struck in the form of Lord Carlisle, a notorious rake whose debts were exceeded only by his malice. Lord Carlisle called out, loud enough to draw attention, commenting on how Wentworth was still dancing attendance on the merchant's daughter. He wondered aloud, with vicious speculation, how much old Hartley might be paying for someone to court that abundance of feminine charms. Or perhaps, he continued, warming to his theme, it was a matter of necessity. Everyone knew the Wentworth estates were in dire straits. He supposed even a man of breeding must lower himself when creditors came calling, though surely there were prettier heiresses, even among the merchant class, ones who didn't require reinforced chairs. The laughter that followed was uncertain, uncomfortable, but present nonetheless. This author watched Meg's face crumble, watched her try to maintain dignity as tears gathered in her eyes. And Thomas, oh, gentle listeners, Thomas stood frozen, his face white with rage, but his feet rooted to the floor. For 5 eternal seconds, Thomas Wentworth stood silent while the women tittered behind their fans and the men smirked into their champagne. Then Meg, with more dignity than this author has seen before or since, turned and walked from the ballroom, her head high despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Thomas finally moved then, starting after her, but Mrs. Dalrymple intercepted him with soothing words about not distressing himself over that unfortunate scene. Lord Carlisle was crude, she admitted, but perhaps not entirely wrong. She urged him to come dance with Cecilia instead. This author watched Thomas be led away, looking back toward the door through which Meg had disappeared. The expression on his face was one of utter self-loathing. The next morning, Thomas called at Hartley House only to be told Miss Hartley was indisposed. He called again that afternoon, still indisposed. For 2 weeks, he haunted their doorstep only to be turned away. Letters were returned unopened. He even attempted to waylay her at church, but Meg had developed an uncanny ability to sense his presence and escape through side doors. This author's maid network reported that Meg spent those weeks in her room, emerging only to help with the accounts, her eyes red-rimmed, and her usual sharp wit dulled to nothing. She ate little, spoke less, and threw herself into her father's business with the kind of desperate focus that suggested she was trying to calculate her way out of heartbreak. The crisis that would ultimately unite our pair came from an unexpected source: the weather. January of 1813 was brutal. Snow fell for days, roads became impassable, and Thomas's estates, already struggling, faced disaster. The harsh weather had destroyed winter stores, livestock were dying, and his tenants faced starvation. Worse, the careful financial plan Meg had created required precise timing of sales and purchases. Timing now impossible, with roads closed and markets frozen. This author learned from Thomas's valet that his master hadn't slept in 3 days, trying desperately to recalculate, replan, save his people from disaster. But without Meg's quick mind, he was lost in a labyrinth of numbers that wouldn't add up to salvation. Finally, desperation overcame pride. At 2 o'clock on a bitter Tuesday morning, Thomas appeared at the Hartley home, not at the front door, but at the servants' entrance. He bribed a footman who woke a maid who was persuaded to knock on Meg's door. This author has pieced together what followed from various sources, though none were actually present in the room where it happened. Thomas was shown to Mr. Hartley's study, where Meg appeared in her wrapper, her hair in a simple plait, fury and hurt warring in her eyes. He announced without preamble that people were going to starve. He didn't care if she hated him, if she never spoke to him again after tonight, but he needed her help, or 13 families wouldn't survive the winter. The argument that followed was, by all accounts, spectacular. Meg accused him of cowardice, of using her for her mind while being ashamed of her body. Thomas tried to explain, to apologize, but Meg would have none of it. She reminded him how he had stood there while they laughed at her, saying nothing. Thomas admitted his cowardice, his terror. When she demanded to know what he had been terrified of, being associated with the fat merchant's daughter, he finally burst out with the truth. He had been terrified of them seeing how much he loved her. The words, once spoken, could not be taken back. This author's sources report a full minute of absolute silence. Thomas continued, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. He had loved her since she told him about the Scottish wool, since she saved his estates with 3 hours of calculations. He had loved her through every meeting, every letter, every moment. When Carlyle had said those vile things, he froze because he knew if he started defending her, he wouldn't stop. He would have declared himself there in front of everyone, and she deserved better than a proposal born of rage in a ballroom. Meg countered that she deserved better than silence while being mocked, and Thomas agreed simply. She deserved everything. A man who would fight dragons for her, not a tongue-tied fool who freezes when it matters most. But his tenants didn't deserve to starve for his failings. He begged her to help them, if not him. They worked through the night. This author learned that Meg's brilliant solution involved converting part of the estate to growing turnips. Unglamorous, but hardy enough to survive the weather and nutritious enough to keep the tenants fed. She found buyers for future wool at premium prices, negotiated credit from suppliers, and created a financial framework that would see them through. As dawn broke, the work was done. The estates would survive. Thomas thanked her quietly and prepared to leave her in peace. He was at the door when Meg called him a coward once more. When he turned back, resigned, agreeing with her assessment, she continued. He was her coward, but only if he was brave enough to claim her publicly, all of her, in front of everyone who had laughed. The opportunity came at the Frost Fair 3 days later. The Thames had frozen solid, and all of society had ventured onto the ice for the novelty. Booths sold hot chestnuts and mulled wine, children skated past in laughing groups, and the ton promenaded in their finest furs, pretending the cold didn't affect them. This author was purchasing a rather delightful pamphlet of scandal when a commotion drew everyone's attention. Thomas Wentworth had climbed onto a makeshift platform where a puppet show had just concluded. He announced to the gathered crowd that he had something to say. 2 weeks ago, Lord Carlyle had said something unforgivable about a lady of his acquaintance. He had failed to respond then, a failing he would regret for the rest of his life. He would respond now. Looking directly at Carlyle, who had just arrived with his usual coterie of sycophants, Thomas declared clearly that the man had insulted Miss Margaret Hartley, a woman whose intelligence had saved his estates, whose kindness had improved the lives of 13 tenant families, and whose company he valued above all the empty-headed beauty in London. Carlyle had mocked her figure while his own character was so twisted that no amount of tailoring could hide its deformity. The crowd gasped. This author nearly dropped her pamphlet. Thomas continued, now addressing the assembled ton. He declared himself sick to death of the hypocrisy before him. Half of them wore fabric supplied by Hartley Textiles while sneering at the family that provided it. They mocked Miss Hartley's size while stuffing themselves at every opportunity. They called her common while displaying manners that would shame a farmhand. He jumped down from the platform and walked directly to where Meg stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, her parents flanking her in equal shock. Dropping to one knee right there on the ice, Thomas made his declaration. He was a man of modest means and numerous flaws. He smelled of hay more often than cologne. He cared more about crop yields than cravat knots. He had dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his hands. but he loved her with every particle of his being. He loved her brilliant mind, her generous heart, and yes, since society seemed so concerned about it, he loved every curve that made her who she was. He asked for the honor of her hand in marriage, promising to spend his life proving worthy of her, though he knew he never truly could be. This author must confess to requiring her own smelling salts at this point. The silence that followed was absolute. All of London's society held its breath. Then Meg laughed. Not a bitter laugh or a hysterical one, but a genuine, delighted laugh that seemed to bubble up from some deep well of joy. She observed loudly enough for all to hear that he had forgotten to mention he was also terrible at mathematics without her. Thomas agreed that he was appallingly terrible and would be bankrupt within a year without her help. Meg declared that she supposed she must accept, if only to save those poor tenant families from his accounting. The kiss that followed was not, strictly speaking, proper for public display. But this author noticed something wonderful. As Thomas kissed his bride-to-be thoroughly and enthusiastically, the crowd's reactions split. The Lord Carlyles and Mrs. Dalrymples of the world turned away in disgust. But others, more than you might expect, gentle listeners, began to applaud. Old Lord Pemberton called out that it was about time someone showed those young pups what real devotion looked like. Lady Morrison added that at least this marriage wouldn't bore them all to death with its predictability. And young Miss Sarah Carlyle, Lord Carlyle's own sister, was heard to observe that if that was what love looked like, then she had been accepting the wrong sort of proposals. They were married 6 weeks later, in a ceremony that was modest by ton standards, but rich in genuine feeling. This author attended, of course, and can report that the bride wore cream silk from her father's warehouse. No hiding in dark colors now, and the groom had dirt under his fingernails from checking his fields that morning. Neither seemed to care. The wedding breakfast featured an unusual toast from Mr. Hartley, who raised his glass to his daughter who had saved his business more times than he could count, and to his son-in-law, who was smart enough to value her for it. The Wentworth estates prospered under their joint management. Meg handled the accounts while Thomas worked the land, and together they turned a failing property into one of the most successful in the county. They became known for paying fair wages, treating tenants well, and hosting harvest festivals where everyone, regardless of class, danced together. This author visited them 5 years later. Meg had grown more confident, moving through her home with the assurance of a woman who knew her worth. Thomas had grown more successful, but still smelled faintly of hay. They had 3 children who were being taught both mathematics and farming, regardless of gender. But what struck this author most was witnessing a quiet moment between them. Thomas was reading a letter about wool prices while Meg worked on accounts. Without looking up, he reached out and took her hand, threading their fingers together. She squeezed back, still calculating. It was the casual intimacy of a couple who had found their perfect match, not in beauty or rank, but in partnership. Thomas mentioned to this author over tea that he had once thought he needed to marry for money or beauty or connections, but thanked God he was smart enough to marry for brilliance instead. Meg added with a smile that he had also married someone who could teach him that revenue and profit were not the same thing. Thomas agreed, lifting her hand to kiss it, that this was especially true. And so, dearest listeners, we reach the end of our tale. A story that proves love can bloom in ledger books as easily as in ballrooms, that true partnership matters more than perfect figures, and that sometimes the best revenge against society's cruelty is to succeed despite it. This author withdraws now, leaving you with this thought: the tongue judges by appearances, but the heart judges by truth. And truth, gentle listeners, will always find its way to the surface, just as cream rises despite the weight above it. Until our next encounter, remember that the greatest scandals often lead to the greatest happiness. And perhaps, just perhaps, the next time you see someone dismissed for their appearance, you might look closer at their substance. You never know when you might be overlooking your own perfect match. Your devoted chronicler, Lady Ravenswood.